So remember last time we looked at the text of the Old Testament and we realized that there's really not many copies of the Hebrew Old Testament that are being relied upon because the old ones get destroyed. We're talking about Hebrew texts of the Old Testament. And now today we're going to look at Old Testament information that comes from ancient versions. And remember, a version is a translation. And these are actually somewhat more valuable than the Hebrew Old Testament texts we have, with exception Dead Sea Scrolls. But most of these versions, remember we said that before we had Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest Hebrew texts we had were penned around 900 AD. That's really late, even compared against our New Testament text. Dead Sea Scrolls comes out 1,000 years better. But now these ancient translations, many of them were penned in the first couple centuries AD. So it actually predates the Hebrew text that we had. So that's why these are so valuable. But you got to take them with a grain of salt because they're in other languages. But they're valuable. So for instance, you got the Samaritan Pentateuch. And there's the Samaritan high priest. Very nice. The Samaritan Pentateuch, you can trace back its origins to 400 BC. We don't have copies from 400 BC. But remember, the Samaritans in the north of Israel, they were kind of, to use a harsh term, half-breeds. They were marital intermixes with the Assyrians after the captivity, and they came back home. They came back home into the northern tribe areas, so they're sort of, but even before that, the northern kingdom, right after Solomon, the split, the spiritual split, so we're talking like 900 BC, they sort of went off and did their own thing. They decided that they didn't need the temple in Jerusalem, blah, blah, blah. They set up their own temple, not their temple, but their own altars in the north. So their theology started to skew, and so they also wrote their own Pentateuch, their own 5 Mosaic books. They had a copy they used for that, and they did some slight alterations to accommodate in 900 BC their disrespect for the southern temple in Jerusalem and doing their own thing in the north. So you have to take this with a grain of salt, but the stuff that they didn't change is really valuable. So remember, this were the northern 10 tribes. They came back, they returned to the north, and the different stuff about the Mount Ebal worship practices that the Orthodox people in the south in Jerusalem said, you can't do this. There's only one place. It's in Jerusalem. They said, no, we can do whatever we want to do. So they actually wrote in what they wanted to do in the Pentateuch. And so there's a few but major differences, and you can kind of attribute it back to what they wanted to do. Basically, not to want to do anything that has to rely on Jerusalem. Then we're racing. So that was the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Aramaic Targums. I just love this. The Aramaic Targums. Targums means commentary. So if you bought a Bible today that wasn't a literal translation, but it was more of a paraphrase, that's what the Targums are, but even looser than that. The Targums are people talking about the content of the Bible, and they often quote the Bible. So Aramaic, this is the Aramaic that was spoken after the Babylonian captivity. So for roughly those 5 centuries before Jesus, this is the Aramaic of the north. If you think of Aramaic, by the way, it was like the universal street language in the Middle East, all the way from Turkey almost down to Egypt. It was like everywhere. It was the language. And it actually spawned specialties. If you went over toward the east into Syria, you had a Syrian version of it, which still exists today, in fact. When Mel Gibson did his movie, about Christ, he wanted people to speak actual Aramaic, so he got extras out of Syria. They actually still spoke Aramaic, so that's kind of interesting. But anyway, this comes after. It's written in the Aramaic of then. To distinguish it from the Syrian Aramaic, it's called the Western Aramaic, and which really sort of starts to emerge around the 1st century. It's an oral paraphrase of the Bible, so it's not a literal, but since they quote a lot, it's valuable for that purpose. There's 2 principal ones that we use today. The Targum Onkelos, which is just a paraphrase of the Torah, the first 5 books, and then the Targum Jonathan, which is a paraphrase of the prophets. So they're useful in that sense, but they're not literal, but they can give you a good view into what's going on in the Old Testament, because when you do translations, these guys are actually doing oral paraphrases at the time in the first couple of centuries. So they were closer to the actual writings when they did their paraphrase. So when we try to understand the Hebrew of what it means, you can get these guys paraphrased from a couple centuries. So it's valuable for that. It's not a literal translation, but it's valuable. Yes, almost entirely, with side notes. Yeah. So you can check their understanding against what you think it should be. It's a similar way, in fact, we'll talk about in a second, the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. So you got Greek guys down in Alexandria translating the Old Testament into Greek, and it's very valuable because like a century or so before Jesus, you can see how they interpreted the Hebrew and then put it into Greek. So, and what Greek words worked for it. So that whole translation process, even though it's fraught with some problems, it teaches us a lot about the contemporary understanding. So this is the same thing. It teaches a lot about the contemporary understanding. The Syriac Peshitta. Woohoo! So this is the Aramaic that's in the east. So this is the Syrian Aramaic. So Aramaic was everywhere, even during the time of Jesus. Then there's the Syrian, and then there's a Western. So this is the Syrian Aramaic, which is called Syriac, just in short form. Peshitta just means common. So there was a lot of commentary style, like the previous one we saw. They didn't want to do a commentary. They just wanted to have the simple document of the Old Testament. So that's why it's called the Peshitta. It's without any extra comments. It's just the Old Testament. But it's in Syriac, which is really helpful to us. It was begun being written in the 1st century A.D. So see, that's why that's really valuable to us. Now we have people in the 1st century interpreting Hebrew for us for the purpose of translating it into Syriac and taking it far up to the north. We have Syriac language New Testament that gets carried off into Syria about the same time this got started. So they're actually parallel traditions. And if you think about 70 AD in Jerusalem, what happens in 70 AD? Yeah, Titus comes in and wrecks the place, and as a result, wrecks Jerusalem and the temple. And as a result, it causes an exodus of nearly everyone of any religious values out of Israel. So not only did the Christians kind of go away, but the Jews did a lot more because it was termed a Jewish rebellion. So the Jews, and at the time, the Christians were a sect of Judaism. They were seen that way too. So about the time of Titus in 70 AD, a lot of these people just split and left town. And so you have this dispersion going on of the Jews and the Christians. And at that time, the Jews said, we've got to get our act together. As we go, we've got to take the Bible with us in a way that's going to work. Since many were going to Syria, they decided to make a translation into Syriac and carry it to there. So this is part of the kind of the diaspora that happened after the Roman Jewish wars. So that's what you're seeing here. By the way, here's a piece I found online. It was produced in Amida, which is in Syria, in 464 AD. Now that's a pretty early age, if you think about it. And compared to the fact that that's nearly 500 years before the oldest Hebrew Bible copy that we have. So that's why these are really valuable. Then you get the Latin Vulgate, which you talked about before because of Jerome, also known as Hieronymus. But Jerome did the Latin Vulgate. He translated it from Hebrew, and this is a big deal. So remember his dates right there are the late 300s. So this is a big deal because the old Latin that pre-existed Jerome's efforts, the old Latin of the Old Testament was translated from the Greek Old Testament done a century before Jesus. So when you read the old Latin at the time of Jerome and the church, it was from the Septuagint, from the Greek. And so Jerome decided to do his own translation, not only the New Testament, but the Old. When he decided to do the Old Testament, he started using the Greek Old Testament first. And then he says, you know what? I could probably do a better job if I came from the Hebrew, but I don't know Hebrew. So Jerome moves to Jerusalem, actually to Bethlehem. If you visit Bethlehem today, you'll see statues of Jerome because he moves to Bethlehem. He learns Hebrew, and then he starts a decade-long process of translating the Hebrew Old Testament into Latin. Now, it's politically dangerous because the likelihood that he's going to come up with the same old Latin that's being used at the time from the Catholic Church and the Church Fathers is low because he's going to translate from Hebrew. It was almost heretical. So he's doing this and comes out with the Latin Vulgate, the Latin which is now a second Latin Old Testament from the Old Latin to the Vulgate. He does this and they don't match. Not entirely, but they don't conflict in any solid ways. But it is different enough that you have this gigantic fight going on. So when he came out with the Vulgate, everyone was ticked off. I mean, everyone was ticked off. But he felt it was intellectually honest to go back to the Hebrew and translate Hebrew to Latin, not Hebrew to Greek Septuagint to Latin in the Old Latin. So it's actually the ancient equivalent of the present day King James Wars, is what it is. But it's about the Old Testament. So anyway, we bring this up because, look, he did this translation at that time. That precedes the Masoretes. Remember, the Masoretes are like 500 to 900 AD. And the oldest Hebrew we had before Dead Sea Scrolls was Masorete, like 900 AD. So his translation, even though it's in Latin, comes from the Hebrew. So it's only one step away from the Hebrew. So that's very valuable, and it's very early. That also makes it valuable. So if you can back out his foibles in translation, and there's a couple of them, but he actually fixed some over time. Brilliant man, how he can learn Hebrew and then do a relatively coherent version of the Latin Bible is it's astonishing. Because his Latin Vulgate then became the Bible of the church way up until the Reformation. So it was a big deal. Critics dislike the conflicts. LLX is the shorthand for Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament done before Jesus. But it is a great view into what the Hebrew text of the Old Testament is when he did his translation to Latin just in the 3rd century. That's a cool deal. So if you can get through the translation issues, you can still get back to the Hebrew, get some nice confirmations. And then lastly, the Septuagint. Septuagint is just Latin for 70. And why is it 70? Because there were 72 translators. That's close enough to 70, we'll call it Septuagint. So anytime you see a footnote somewhere that says this comes from the LXX, Roman numerals for 70, that's the Greek Old Testament penned before Jesus, about a century plus. So it's a Greek Old Testament. There's stories about how it came to be, and they place it during the time of Ptolemy II, which is post-Alexander the Great. Remember Alexander the Great went and took over the world? That's like 320 BC, 322 BC. I think that's when he died. But then the remnants of the Greek Empire stayed for a while, especially in Egypt. The most principal city after Alexander's conquest is a city named after Alexander called Alexandria. Yeah. So in Alexandria, a huge kind of Boston-like intellectual culture built up. And out of there, during Ptolemy II, that reign, they're pretty sure based on one document about how the translation came to be, that it happened there during this time. There's no reason to doubt the document, but it's that one document that says they picked 6 translators out of every tribe. That gets you 72. And then those guys sat down and made a Greek translation of the Hebrew. So that's the Septuagint. Comes out of Alexandria. There's lots of textual variations with the Hebrew text that we accept today. Most of them are quite minor, but there are a lot of differences. And that has caused some consternation, especially because in the New Testament writers, the guys we know and love, they quoted out of the Septuagint, out of the Greek Old Testament. Now, Paul could read the Hebrew Old Testament, but you had to be a trained Pharisee or a Sadducee or a scribe to know Hebrew. It mostly wasn't taught much in the households. A little bit, enough for you to get past a bar mitzvah, and that's about it. But you had to rely on those guys. So for people who wanted to have a street understanding of the Old Testament, you use the Greek one, which is Septuagint. And guys like Peter and John, these guys quoted the Septuagint. They quoted the accessible Greek Old Testament. And as a result of that, when you see Old Testament quotes in the New Testament, and in your side reference it says this comes from Isaiah such and such, and you go to Isaiah such and such, and you compare it, and they don't match. It's largely the Septuagint's reason. That's why it's like that. Largely. So as a result, it's sort of a secondary authority. But again, it's valuable to know what they thought about what the Hebrew said in Greek 2 centuries before Jesus. So that's why it's really valuable in that sense. And it's used by the writers of the New Testament. So that's Septuagint. And again, the Septuagint was valuable for a long time. But when the centralized Christian church around the 5th century, started getting institutionalized. They standardized on the Roman tongue, Latin. And so the Latin Old Testament, Jerome's Vulgate, became the standard of the Old Testament up until the 1500s. Actually, to this day, when they read Latin in the Catholic Church, it's the Vulgate. So it was just a gigantic thing. But why not use the Septuagint? Well, because Greek was falling out of favor in terms of general use worldwide, and Latin was coming into favor as an echo from the Roman occupations. So, and we get these words out of the Greek. I don't know if you knew that. All these words have Greek origins, and if we hadn't had the Septuagint, a lot of these we wouldn't be using. So, it's interesting. Okay. So remember, there's two gigantic differences between the New and Old Testament transmission, and we're going to do an experiment to show you what it's like to do that, and you're going to be the translators. There's this, where you have the New Testament manuscripts, where you have a gazillion of them that were penned over a long time. So we're talking about any scrap of paper that has the New Testament in Greek, written all the way from the papyruses in the 2nd century, that's the hundreds, all the way up until these ones you get the lecterns and the church fathers. The minuscules are the low, they're like the lowercase Greek. That was the Greek style that came later. That's just a font style. Unsealed scale. So we see all of these laying on the ground. And you pick them up, and they're not total Bibles. Some of them are total Bibles way back here, right here. Some of those are total Bibles on the far left. Most of them are fragments. So now the task is, how do you take all these fragments, which may disagree, but often don't, how do you take all these fragments and reconstitute a whole Bible? So that's the task, and it's error corrected by the fact that you have tons of copies from tons of places where they've been carried to. So that's one way of transmission. The other way is the Old Testament way, where you have the Masoretic tradition, these guys who had this solid code about how you pass forward copies. You do it a really strict kind of way. But they really are the 6th century on. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls show up, which come up centuries before Jesus, and now it gives you a 1,000-year test to see how good they propagated the Old Testament in a serial fashion from the time of Jesus up until the Masoretic texts we have in like 900. So again, the oldest texts we had before 1947, Dead Sea, oldest texts were penned around late 800s, early 900s AD. That's the oldest Hebrew text we had. Dead Sea Scrolls show up a couple centuries BC. We have nothing in between. So now everyone holds their breath to see if what's been put in those jars a couple centuries before Jesus in Hebrew matches the Hebrew we have that were penned by the Masoretes in like 900 AD. That's a 1,000-year test of propagation. And these kind of analyses have been done over and over again, and it's remarkably similar. I mean, in 1,000 years without Xerox machines, it's astonishing. So that's just a testament to how well the Masoretic rules were in terms of passing forward with no errors. So, okay. So let's, I'm just going to pass through this. If you remember, they had this kind of number system to figure out how to make the copies perfect, and they did number checking. We're going to do number checking in a second to show you that. So let's do the Old Testament transmission. So I need 3 volunteers. I want you to come up here and you can help me, and you need to bring a pencil. Just 3 volunteers. Any 3 volunteers who can count. And you got to bring a pencil. Yay, there's one. Okay, this is going to be your scribal copy. VJ, this is going to be your scribal copy. Yeah. I need one more person. Have a pencil, VJ? Okay. This one's easier than the next one, so all of you are in the next one. Okay, so come up here because people are watching. Let's do this over here. So I'm going to start over here on the left side with the absolute, be right here, Steve. I'm going to be over here with the absolute original copy. This was written by Moses in his hand right here. And I have a phrase at the top of this. I think I got a picture. Okay, that's what I'm holding in my hand right now, is that. And the phrase that we're going to propagate isn't the entire, no, don't look at that, you guys. You can't look at that because we're going to pass it this way. So we're going to pass that phrase right there, Old Testament style. And every generation of this is going to be like hundreds of years of generations of passing it forward. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass this message, and then we're going to do an error check by counting things, okay? So I'm going to start right here, and I'm going to let Steve look at this phrase. So you just copy that phrase, what you think that is. Don't let them see it. So this is 100-year passing right here. So he's looking at the original text. He's writing it down on his copy, on his new copy. Okay? And then at the bottom of the sheet, after he finishes that, I'm going to ask him to do, we'll just do 4 counts. You know, make it so she can read it too, because you're going to pass it on. Okay. So now, before I let you pass that on, you have to just do the top 4 things right there, and come up with a number, and then we are going to check numbers before I let you pass it on. So he needs to count the number of words, and then he's going to count the number of letters, not counting the spaces. And then he's going to count the number of consonants. Oh boy, this is tough now. And then he's going to count the number of vowels. This is a typical counting process you do. Now, we're only doing this because I'm telling him he can pass on, well, actually, I can destroy my copy as soon as I know that his is perfect. And I won't know his is perfect unless my numbers agree with his numbers about the number of words, the number of letters, the number of vowels, stuff like that. So he's doing his counting. We're leaving out the bottom one because going to the middle letter takes way too long to calculate. You go, oh! That's too hard. But that was the hardest one to do, and they did that. They counted middle letter in books and middle letters in the entire Torah. What? Yeah, tedious. Okay, you got your numbers yet?
I think I've got the middle letter too.
Oh, okay. So tell me what your numbers are from the first to the fourth one.
5, 23, 15, 8.
It is so good, I'm destroying this one. Now do the same with her. Now let her just see the text.
Just see the text. All right.
And copy it well enough so that VJ will be able to see it later on. So see, these are what we call serial transmissions. One's going to go to the next, to the next, to the next. It'll be different than the New Testament, multiple serial transmissions. So now, Maria's adding up, and Steve's wondering whether he should throw away his copy yet.
Eat it.
Pick up my mess. Hey!
My wife's in the hospital.
Oh no.
In intensive care. She passed out last night. And she's,
So you can destroy and then pass on just the message.
so
Okay.
no visitors.
Okay, I'll tell that.
And it wouldn't hurt to pray for her.
We'll do that.
Okay.
Wow, last night?
Huh.
Last night?
This morning, it was about 4 o'clock this morning.
Oh, wow.
I had the ambulance haul her down, and I've been down talking to her. And they've got her in intensive care. She passed out, I think she was at the soup kitchen. She works with the soup kitchen, and I think she might have got a little food poisoning.
My food poisoning. We'll pray for her.
Okay,
Wow.
all right,
Okay. Thanks.
okay.
Oh. Did you destroy yours?
Yep.
We'll put it in the Geniza. So while they're finishing that, I'm going to pass out the New Testament one. You can go ahead and have a seat, Steve. You're a dead scribe. Okay, now VJ, just do the first two number things, the first 2 counting things. So I'm going to let you sit where you are because it'll demonstrate that the New Testament was done in a distributed way geographically. So this is your copying rules is what I'm going to give to you. Do you want to do some? You want to do one? Yeah, one for Joyce and one for you. Yep. Who else is here? We'll do that one. Okay, Ian, I'm going to give you a special one. This one. Okay.
We have the first two.
And they match?
Yes.
Okay, then Marie can tear hers up. And
What are the consonants?
well, we're not going to do that because we're running out of time.
Okay.
So here's the deal. After we've done this 3-generation passing, the only document left is the one VJ has. The rest have been destroyed because they were substandard and the ink was falling off. So this is why the oldest copy we had until Dead Sea Scrolls was penned in the 900s, because everyone before that went through an error check process that declared the copy perfect and the old ones were destroyed or buried or burned. So this is a relatively error-free process because of how rigorous the error checking in the county is. That's what makes this so good. And then the Masoretes came up with this wonderful system of rules about how you do it, so they would make sure it was just very careful. So this is an example of an error-free process that happens because of rigorous rules and rigorous error checking. Okay, let me take the only copy we have left. Let me give you one of these. Okay. Okay, now we're going to do New Testament. And New Testament is not rigorous rules, and it's not rigorous error checking. It's neither of those. It compensates by having tons of copies. So here's what this is going to look like. I've got the master in my hand right here, and I don't want you to see what the message is because you're going to get that message in a translation, and we're going to go through 3 different levels, 3 different generations that would simulate hundreds of years, and the different tracks would simulate different geographies. Okay? And this in terms of Greek pieces of paper would total up to over 5,000 pieces of paper we have laying on the ground from this process. So if I'm level 0 with the autograph, with the original one, so if there are level 1 people here, raise your hand if you're a level 1. You'd be a first generation. Okay, so I'm going to come around and let you copy off of this to the level 1s. And after you copy this, and you have special copying rules on the top of your sheet. So follow those rules. And then I'm going to have the level 1 people give to the level 2 people. Who else is level 1? You are? Okay. So Karen and Ellie Mae are first generation copyists. And then once they've copied, and remember, follow the rules at the top of your sheet and hold on to your papers. So level 1s, find any level 2s in the room so that they can copy off your sheet. So if you're a level 2, raise your hand. You have one level 2? Oh, VJ's a level 2? Does it say level 2 on your sheet? Yeah. Okay. Then follow the rules of your copy sheet, and then here comes the copy you can copy from. In fact, Ellie Mae, why don't you bring your copy too? Since you're both copy 1s, your first level 1s, why don't you have one of them copy off of one of yours and one of them copy off of the other one? So remember to follow the rules at the top of your sheet. It's important. Most of you, the rule says copy exactly, but some of yours don't. And it simulates kind of what the errors were at the time. By the way, Scott and I have schemed for years about how to do this across the nation with letters. And to collect the information when we get back and then see how it looks, just to simulate, and then write something about how you can find out what's there, but we haven't done much about that. Okay, so if level 2s have their copy according to the rules, then the level 2s have to show their copies to a level 3. So if you're a level 3, raise your hand. Make sure you use the copyist rules. So there's a level 3 back there. We have to show them our copy. If you're a level 2. You're a level 3? Actually, I have 3 level 3s. So who's level 2? Who's level 2? Okay, you two need to show your thing. And Neil's a level 3? Okay. Then you guys still have to go out and show them to the other people who have their hands up, the other level 3s. Just let them look at it so they can copy it. So remember to use the copy rules. I left out some good instructions. So raise your hand if you still need to copy from. Okay. Good, Ian. And Janice needs something? Make sure you get your copy back from after he's copied and take it back after he's copied. It's like a game. And I'm going to ask you in a second whether it's a very famous game or not. Do all the level 3s have? Did you get your message? Yeah. Okay. So now let's have someone collect up all of the copies. Okay. So you're up. So go ahead and collect everybody's copy. And then kind of shuffle them up like a deck of cards. Shift them around. Okay, we have all the copies. Okay, so now this is like what we find archaeologically today. We have a mix of that's good enough. We have a mix of different Greek New Testaments, all written in different periods, right? And they're just a scatter. And there's like 5,000 of these. So now, for instance, let me read to you. Here's a level 1 one. We can tell by the handwriting that it's an early one. And remember, the message is Jesus Christ is the Messiah. This one, level 1, early, says Jesus Christ is Messiah. Does that change the meaning? No. Here's another one. Level 3, very late. Jesus Christ is Messiah. It's missing the, but since it's a later one, it's probably because it's from the earlier era. That helps. Here's one from level 1. Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Yes. Perfect. Okay. Here's a level 3. It's a late one again. Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Well, that's pretty good. Okay. Level 3, we didn't get a chance to do this. This one says to fix any obvious misspellings, but I forgot to put out the misspelling copy of sheet. But it says Jesus Christ is the Messiah, so that's good. Level 3, a late one again, Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Very bad penmanship, but that's okay, we can still read it. Which is not unlike, and then here is, let's see, let me do these two. Here's a level 2, a medium level one. Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Perfect. Level 2, Jesus Christ is Messiah. We have the same error again. Now, 3 times in the copies we've seen that the is left out. That would count literally as 3 problems with the Bible, because the same word got dropped in 3 copies. So one error like that is notated as 3 errors total. So it's just discrepancies in the text, even though it's the same error, but it's in 3 texts. And then here's an interesting one, level 3, so this is a late one. Jesus Christ is the one and only Messiah. Oh, they added one and only. But now, is that a bad addition or a good addition? I mean, is it a false addition? No, it's informed by the other text. It's actually a helpful addition. So that's This is actually about statistically, this is much more error than we normally would have. But based on the date of the transcript and the commonality of the error, like the word "the" being dropped out, you can tell sort of in the passing of the text where it got dropped out, and the later ones copied it. So that's where you have to know when it was written. Got to do all the archaeology to figure out how it's written and when it's written. And then the additions, like that one, the one and only, good addition, Ian. Ian's the guy who added it for us. Those additions, every single time, are things that the copyist thought would help clarify the text. But they're not part of the original text. So in the newer modern translations, if that's not in the original text, even though it's a nice and helpful addition, we drop it out. And in the margins, many times we'll say, this was added to the text and these other things, but it's not in the original manuscripts because the level 1s and 2s, as a majority, didn't have those words in them. But this one does. It's clearly a help, is what it is. So when it's a help, you can spot it. And then when the words are missing, that's the other major error. When the words are missing, it usually has nothing to do with the meaning of the thing, because Jesus Christ is Messiah or Jesus Christ is the Messiah means the same thing. The same thing. The other large share of differences that are counted as errors in the text is when things are spelled slightly differently because the spelling in Greek shifted over the years. For instance, the I sound was originally written with an I, and over time it got written as an EI instead. That's counted as an error in the text because it's different from what the other text said. So by and large, what you can do is if you have enough of these, and here again, here's the error correction. If you have enough of these that you find, 5,000 plus, and you find them in different geographical areas, which means that they've been moved away from the influence of all the other ones, they're like time capsules when they go to geographical areas, and they come from different geographical areas, you can, with a very high likelihood, surmise what the original text said, with a very high likelihood. In the case of the King James, instead of having 5,000 of these, we only have 6, and the earliest was penned in 900 A.D. So that's why the debate goes on with the King James. They'll claim that those 6 they had, actually closer to 7, were somehow more holy than the other 5,000, but there's no reason to believe that. And in fact, when you take the King James text, they are very, very good. But there are some minor changes with the other 5,000 that were written centuries before. So the modern translations say, I think it's fair to let's use all of them, and then let's make some rational guesses about what the original text said. And that's what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago about the UBS 5 version that's out of the Greek New Testament. It really is a century of people debating the small changes and debating what the exact Greek text was. But again, you're missing these. You're missing slight variations in the spelling, and sometimes you have additions that try to help the text. And there's a really classic one in 1 John 5 where someone helped the text. And actually we know the person who helped the text was Erasmus, who put it in his 3rd edition of the Greek New Testament. It was not in his 1st and 2nd because it was a side note in previous editions, and when he got to the 3rd edition, the guys who were funding the printing of his 3rd edition said, you put that in or we will not fund you. So he took the side note and he included it into 1 John. To this day, if you read 1 John and you have a modern Bible, it'll either include that or not include that, but it'll have a little star saying, this is not in the original text. Another famous one that's like that is the woman caught in adultery. That does not show up in any of the early manuscripts. It was added somewhere later on. But it's an interesting case all by itself because nearly every scholar, without exception, say, this sounds like John, this looks like John, this looks like Jesus, even though it wasn't in the original early manuscripts, like Sinaiticus, even though it's not in the early manuscripts, it really ought to be there. It's an oral tradition story that we deem as being authentic. It's just that John never wrote it down. And it got included in John. So stuff like that. That's what goes on. Okay, we got to quit. So any questions?